I've posted this before. Donald Trump came into the movie theater I used to work at, and I served him at the concession stand. He asked about the flavors of our slushies. They were white cherry and cotton candy. He got the cotton candy. Donald Trump enjoys cotton candy, and I literally know that for a fact forever now. He also paid an exact change. When I was a kid I was friends with a very wealthy kid. We went to the same boxing gym. He was the son of someone very important in California, probably an oil mogul or something. One day we were invited to a barbecue to celebrate his birthday, and arriving there his dad takes us on a tour of the giant house, and introduces us to all the other guests who were his friends. One of those guests was Mr. Donald Trump. I shook his hand and he said, "Ow, that's a pretty solid handshake." I said thanks and he asked me if I happened to be Samoan, because I was pretty strong for a 14-year-old. I said my family was from New Zealand, and thus was of Maori descent. He said that's nice, I always wanted to go to New Zealand. Then he told us to study hard and work hard so we all could live in big houses like our hosts when we grew up. Then he went back to talking to the other people. I never talked to him, but I was at a party he attended about 18 months ago. He wasn't rude at all, just odd. He told a story about how Bill Gates once told a room of people that he, Donald, was really smart and had good ideas. It felt weirdly self-conscious on his part. I also met his helicopter pilots, who said that he was a nice guy, always making sure they were taken care of, had eaten, etc. The pilots said the megadouche was his son, Eric. My mom was on a design team when he was building one of his many golf courses like 15 years ago, so she saw him every day. He and Melania hadn't married yet, but they were also in the midst of designing a new estate he had just bought. Tiffany was little and always came into the office with them, but she was basically glued to Melania's hip. They were really close. I was also small, but sometimes if I came into the office to visit my mom Tiffany and I would play, but I don't remember what she was like. Apparently Trump was a really decent guy. He once turned to my mom and said, "You're a designer," and asked about if their kitchen was in a Tudor mansion, what kind of cabinets should they have. My mom was like, "Oh, obviously cherry," and Melania turned to Trump and said, "Ha." And he was like, "Alright, okay, you win." My mom says back then he was pleasant and professional. I also think it's interesting to add that my mom also swears that he was planning his run for president all the way back then, and she overheard them all the time casually mentioning it. Trump owns a golf resort in Scotland not far from my home, and he was speaking at a Chambers of Commerce meeting a couple of years ago, catered by students of the local cookery college, of which I was one. We did little canapes and nibbles, nothing major, but he popped in and thanked us for our efforts and said he enjoyed the food, which was nice of him. He built a golf course in a rich neighboring town a few years ago, and around the time it opened my grandparents and I were on a walk there. It was built on a sea cliff, popular hiking spot before it was built, still is though, and Trump was riding by on a golf cart. He high-fived my grandma. No words were exchanged. Edit: yes, this was at the Palos Verdes course. Not sure if it counts as having met him, but about 2 years ago I was walking out of this public atrium space that's right near Trump Tower in the IBM building, and we saw him and some other businessmen walk out of Trump Tower. Someone around us yelled out, "Hey Trump, you're fired." And he looked over and gave us the classic Donald thumbs up and got into a black SUV. I bumped into him on the street in 2014. I was looking at my watch and ran into him by accident as he was getting out of his car in front of his building. I apologized, he said it was quite alright, and we went our separate ways. It was very civil, all things considered. I saw him speak at an ICSC NYC convention. The only thing I remember is there was a Q&A part. Some 20-something girl asks if his hair was real, and he says it was, and then asks the girl to come on stage and feel it. So Trump had a younger woman rubbing his head in front of 200 real estate professionals. Did work for one of his golf courses in California. He signed a bunch of shirts that said "You're fired," the Donald on it. He actually seemed pretty reserved and easygoing. Definitely not the persona he portrayed while running for president. I went to school with his daughter Tiffany, so I had a few interactions with the Donald and all were positive. The one anecdote that I'll share is from the school plays. Tiffany was involved in the school theater program and so was my brother, so I was usually helping out as an usher for the plays. Donald attended all the plays that were put on despite living across the country from our school in LA. The thing that was most impressive was how he arrived to the plays. He was always late, just 1 minute late. He'd arrive and take his seat in the rear just after the house lights went down so he didn't draw any attention away from the kids. He'd slip out as quietly as he'd arrived. When he was at the school, his focus was 100% on his daughter and not himself. Despite living in a pretty solid liberal area, most people from that school admit that's it kind of hard to square our experiences with him up with the media's portrayal of him as a brash, egotistical idiot. I worked at one of his golf courses for 3 years as a valet, and I also upkept the practice facilities, including driving around the ball picker-upper. Every time I dealt with Big Donald, he was more than respectful. Also, we had a Mexican guy who cleaned cards, Felipe, who he personally provided housing for out of his own pocket because he thought Felipe was such a good worker and valuable asset to the course, which he was. The guy was such a nice guy and a crazy good worker. All in all, I had a polar opposite view of who Donald Trump was prior to this election cycle. I was in NYC visiting family when I took a walk through Central Park and I sat down at a bench with a couple sodas. I'm relaxing with some music, admiring all the good times people are having, and I feel someone sit down next to me breathing a little hard, like they just took a really long walk or something. I turn and it's actually the Don. He asks if he could have a Coke because he was kinda thirsty, so I gave him one of mine. We talked for like 2 to 3 minutes when a guy comes up behind him and whispers something in his ear, and he says he has to go and hands me a 20 and told me something like, if you need something, don't be afraid to jump at an opportunity. The whole time I'm just kinda sitting there starstruck, like what just happened. Everybody was turning their heads when he walked to his car with the other guy, and a few were looking at me like I was a somebody, and I'm just sitting there confused about everything. He seemed like a reserved guy, pretty chill, and he had a love for that park because he talked about how he took his kids there a lot when they were younger. He showed up at my cousin's Sweet 16 party roughly 7 or 8 years ago. It was at a ballroom at a golf club he owned. He walked in and took pictures with us for maybe 10 minutes. I doubt he actually needed to do any of that. Seemed like a pleasant enough guy. I've played golf at one of his courses in Florida a few times. He's usually there having lunch with his typical group. When they finish, he makes a point to walk around to all of the tables, shake hands and say hello. Always very nice. Since he didn't make a fortune in tech, I imagine he has gotten to where he is by being pretty charismatic. When I was 13, I was invited to a friend's bar mitzvah, and the party was at the clubhouse of one of Trump's golf courses. He was actually there a bit during the cocktail party, checking on the parents of the bar mitzvah boy to make sure everything was up to snuff for them. Shook a lot of people's hands, said hello to everyone. Honestly, my best memory of a celebrity. Very New York story. I am eating dinner at the Silver Star Diner on 2nd Avenue in NYC. This is about 1993. At the table next to me is comedian Jackie Mason. The diner has floor-to-ceiling windows, and outside walks by Trump, Marla Maples, Trump's parents, and couple of other people. Trump sees Mason and walks in and heads to the table. On the way over, his father bumps into my table and knocks over my water. He apologizes and I say it's okay. Marla actually grabs some napkins and starts cleaning it. Trump goes on about what a horror it is, clearly joking, and says he will buy me a new water, as many as you want. Then Jackie Mason goes on for 20 minutes about how cheap Trump is. He has the whole diner in stitches. Trump jokes it's not his fault because he just gave Ivana a whole lot of money. Donald takes it well, but he leaves about halfway through smiling and waving at everyone. I went to school with Donnie Jr. and was friends/teammates with a few guys in his fraternity, so I met him and hung out a few times in a group. Super nice guy. Not pretentious or jerky. Even in a small, closed group, I never heard him say anything remotely bigoted or elitist. And we were 20. Very polished, but genuine guy. I also met Ivanka once and got the same vibe. I went to high school in NY, Brooklyn Tech, and I had a job as a busboy at Four Seasons. Trump was going there quite a bit and actually said hi to me whenever he saw me. The part that impressed me was that he remembered my name. He remembered the name of a busboy he saw maybe twice a month. I think he is a lot smarter than people think. Assistant photographer for a magazine interview. One hell of a dude. I firmly believe everything I saw during the campaign was a facade. Honestly, I still have my reservations about Trump, but I'd be lying if I said that this thread hasn't at least made me question whether he's truly as crazy as he seems. This thread has given me some hope that he might actually be a decent president. My dad met him at one of his golf courses. He was just walking around, walked up to my dad and his friends. They asked him for a picture and he was glad to do it. My dad described him as one of the nicest people he's met, and he's met some pretty cool people. My father claimed to have met Trump in the mid to late 80s. He was at an airport in New York and they had a gift shop. Trump was looking at the books, and as my dad passed by, he recommended Stephen King's IT. Anyway, Trump says thank you and continues browsing. My dad gets his flight provisions and leaves. He's got time to kill, so he gets a coffee and sits down to read the paper. A few minutes later, Trump sits down and says, "I read the back cover. I think this will give me nightmares." My dad said he and Trump just talked like two guys hanging out. Talked a little about the book, talked about New York, and just random chit-chat till my dad had to go. Dad expected Trump to be kind of an ass, but he said Trump was actually a pretty nice guy. My dad said Trump seemed lonely when they talked though,